Hello, it's Ren Presents time. I'm your host, Ren, and today I'm going to do something I've wanted to do for a while. I want to actually narrate one of my books on YouTube. One chapter per video, be about 20 or 30 videos. I'm going to partition off part of my channel to do this, and I'm not a professional voice talent. I'm an author, so forgive my voice and my crass reading. I've chosen the sixth turn of the Shadow Tech Goddess, subtitled Cat. And I chose Cat because usually when people start a book series, when I'm at cons and other shows, people want to buy the beginning, book one, or a suitable starting point, like a standalone. There's several points in my book series to do that. And Cat being at the end so far of the Shadow Tech Goddess series usually gets ignored, and that's a shame because it is one of my more favorite offerings. I'm personally very fond of it. I'm fond of all my books. I mean, I wouldn't put them out unless I was. But this one I think is cool. It turned out really well. Cat took about 4 years to write, and the reasons why a book or any creative project takes a while to conclude is any number of things can do that. Sometimes the publication process and the promoting of the other books slows things down. Sometimes you start it and you have a change of heart, like I did with this book, and what you want the story to be. And sometimes you feel, especially when you're deep into the series, this is the 13th or 14th book. I don't remember chronologically how they go at this point. You start to repeat yourself, and that's the problem I had with this book, as the character Cat was too similar to Countess Sigillis of the House of Blanchford from, the first books in the series. Her story and Sigillis' story were kind of the same, almost identical, and I pride myself on keeping things new, keeping things fresh, and I can't have this. You have to be able, when you're creating something, to be able to see it from a third-person point of view, from a helicopter eye, so to speak. Say, I'm enjoying this, what I'm creating so far, but is anybody else? Or have I walked down this path before? And in Kat's case, I had to say yes. Kat was basically a blonde Sigillis of Metatron. Very similar. That gave me pause. I'm like, I need to breathe some life in this character. She needs to stand on her own. So how can I do that? And I tried various concepts and story beat that I inserted and then deleted at various points. And then once I finally came up with a key concept, that's important. Once you get something down that you can get your imagination behind, something that's fresh and new, then the story basically writes itself. And then that happened, but that took a couple years. Not continuous writing. I always have 2 or 3 irons in the fires. For a while there, I was writing maybe a couple sentences or just revising a few sentences on this book, completely on the back burner. But then once I had that key concept, that key story beat that I wanted to pursue, then the book just rolled itself out. And in order to get Cat sufficiently freed from the Sigillis of Metatron trope, it took about 40,000 words, so the book got almost twice as big as what it would have been. It would have been a fairly short book, 50,000-60,000 words, sort of like Stenabel, but in the end it ended up being somewhere around 120,000-130,000 words. I think the changes I made, the additions to the story, really worked out well. Very happy with what we've got here. So I want to share this book with YouTube and the world because I think it's a fun book. It's a good literary experience. This is crazy science fiction, but it has, as most of my stories do, or I think they do, it has a heart. It has a soul. There's a meaning behind all the doings and a bit of subtext. And in this case, it's the theme that all things, no matter how unlikely, are capable of bettering themselves. And we see that in this book in a number of different ways. So this will be the first of numerous chapter readings. This is the beginning of Cat, the sixth turn of the Shadow Tech Goddess. Again, I'm not a professional reader, I'm just an author, but I'm doing this in one take with editing, obviously. So this isn't a huge blown out production, but I think it'll work out well. And if you stay with it, if you follow these spoken exploits, I think you might find it pretty cool. A few technical features I'm going to flash up on the screen. The chapter I'm reading. If I come across a geographic point or maybe a term that you're not familiar with, I'll try to flash it up on the screen as the chapter goes by. There's a lot of artwork in this book and in all my books, and I'll share those as the story unfolds. So here we go. Part 1, entitled Four Sisters. Chapter 1, The Shade Church. The angels warned her against going underground. There is great danger underground, they said. But there she was, in a place bereft of wind or sunlight, and she was certain she was dying. The tail of her shadow tech flicked spatters of warm blood as she stared at the dead body she had just made. The body lay there gushing blood in a pulseless river, its throat torn out. She ran her shaking hand through her matted hair, leaving a trail of blood. Her claws were caked with congealing flesh. She was alive, the sole survivor, though terribly wounded and bleeding. Her skinny body was soaked with blood from both herself and the person she had killed, while her two companions, those who had shared the darkness and the stone pits of the Shade Church for as long as she could remember, and whom she considered sisters, were dead. One floated headless in a vat of shadow tech, and the other stabbed to death over and over. The horrid image of her sisters dead, murdered, spun in her thoughts as she lay on the dusty floor, unable to stand from blood loss. So this is how she would die, broken, underground, without ever having met her angels and the man they had promised her. She had lived her whole life in the Shade Church, the underground crucible where black hats were trained in the dark. The training consisted of nothing but torment and abuse. Its graduates were those who managed to survive. Like the others crawling in the lightless stone, she was abducted from wherever when, as a mere infant, stolen from her mother's side, her face bearing the accursed shadow mark. She had no idea how long she had been there, with no way to mark the time, no way to record it. She really had no conception of time, other than the rate at which others crowded in the dark with her died, which was often. Everything was a long, extended death in the Shade Church. Huddled in the dark, they told stories. When you die, angels will come and take you away, they said. There is a better place, full of light and color, where the gods and their angels live. Angels, light and color, she had no idea what those things were. She grew from a child who could stand upright in the dark to an adult who had to stoop to avoid hitting her head on the stony ceiling. The arcane Autocon guards that tormented her were cruel and pitiless.
Either you will live to become a black hat, or we will slay you and harvest the shadow tech within.
The black hats and shadow tech. Several concepts were made clear to her by the Autocons. One was that she would, in all probability, not survive the Shade Church, and the other, that she was not a person, but a worthless bit of property owned by the Black Hats to do with as they saw fit. That was it. The shadow mark around her eye branded her as their property. The shadow mark, something she had never seen, bound her into servitude. At one point in her life, she begged to be saved. Perhaps the angel she had heard of would come and save her.
There are no angels here to save you,
the Autocons often said.
There are no angels. There is only hell.
Then the day of her death came at last. They were taken from the pits by the hated Autocon guards, their constant Shadowtech tormentors, and dragged them to the surface. The darkness replaced with an overwhelming force that hurt her eyes. She had to squint to block it out. She had heard that outside of the Shade Church was the opposite of darkness. There were colors and forms. Daring to open her eyes, she endured the pain and could see what was happening around her. She and the others with her on the surface were forced to their knees while a hook was sunk into each of their backs and lodged in place. Then they were all wrenched into midair, dangling from their hooks like pieces of filthy meat. The hook sunk in deep, near her shoulder, causing searing agony. But she was used to agony. She dealt with it constantly. What she wasn't used to were all the things on the surface she had never seen before. She was dazzled by the light around her, by the color, by the drops of cold water that saturated the rags she wore. She was mesmerized by the others hanging on the hooks beside her. She had never seen them before. She had bumped into them in the dark, felt them, fought them sometimes while the Autocons laughed, but never beheld their images before. Glancing down, she saw her own body, pale, dirty, dangling in midair, looking nothing like what she thought it would look like. They were sometimes given piles of rancid sea creatures to devour, and occasionally they would dimly glow, revealing their forms. That's what she thought she would look like a sea creature. Her own body was unimpressive to her. Her fingers twitched, as did her feet, vaguely catching her attention.
"Now we shall burn them,"
came a voice. Barely aware what was happening, the hook she hung from began moving, sending her and the others from the depths down the line toward a raging basin of what she thought might be fire. She had heard of fire before, was threatened with it every day by the Autocons.
"We will burn your worthless body in fire."
But look at it, such light, such color, such warmth. Could this fire be so bad? The end of her life was at hand. She didn't care much about it. Perhaps the next life wouldn't be so hard. But then the line stopped suddenly. She swung back and forth, knocking against those in front of and behind her. The hook in her back digging in, dripping blood. 2 figures came down the line, inspecting those hanging from the hooks. When they got to her, they stopped, standing beneath her dangling feet, looking up at her. They were wearing such amazing things. One of them wore a garment of scintillating color, a shade she could not describe. She couldn't take her eyes off of it. It was the color of life, of mercy. "This one," they said. She was brought down and taken off the hook. The people touched her, tended her aching wound, and washed her body, the fabric of their robes shimmering before her face. "You have much to live for," one of them said, whispering into her ear. That was the first time she had ever experienced any sort of kindness. Punches to the face, claws in the dark, and lashes across her back were all she knew. Touches created pain. Yet here are these people, touching her, healing her, enriching, giving her no pain. Were they her angels? "You have much to live for," they said. The angels selected several more of those who hung from the hooks, bringing them down as well. She could count on her fingers up to 5. Anything past that was beyond her. She counted 1, 2, 3. 3 were brought down, the 3 who would become her sisters. After that day, after being touched by the angels in the color of mercy, she and her 3 new sisters were treated quite differently than the rest at Shade Church. They were removed from the huddled masses in the stony depths and allowed to inhabit a larger area all of their own, still barren, still unbearable, still smothered in darkness, but far better than the cramped pits below. They were given more food, cleaner water, and even frequent baths, and silver fluid cleared their minds of the delirium they had lived in. Still, their treatment was brutal. The hated arcane autocon constructs were their daily scourges, dragging them about like worthless meat, beating them sometimes until they were half dead, tormenting them at their whim. The autocons that terrorized them lived inside their bodies, swimming about like great parasites, and when hers came out, she felt it wrenching itself from her body in a great wave of sickness. One time, she thought she witnessed an autocon coming out of her sister's mouth. She endured the beatings with indifference, the memories of the angel a warm ember in her thoughts. You have much to live for. And then there was Shadowtech, the arcane substance growing within their bodies that howled through their souls and followed them into their sleep in a barbed wire embrace. She could feel it moving about inside her body, and sometimes she could smell it, a primal metallic reek like dried blood. It came out of her pore, sometimes it came out of her mouth. When there was too much inside her, it caused her misery unlike anything else, even more than the hated autocon could inflict upon her. It was something the Black Hats valued, and they took great pains to cultivate, capture, and collect it.
You are worthless shells protecting a precious treasure,
They would hiss.
The Shadowtech within you is ours, understand? You exist to nurture it. Displease us, and we shall do a harvest, pulling it from your body, sending your souls to hell, and leaving you an empty corpse simply to rot.
She and her sisters fully believed what the Black Hats said, that the brackish substance growing inside their bodies, causing them pain, did indeed belong to the Black Hats. The Black Hats carefully regulated when and how she and her sisters could make use of Shadowtech. With the autocons watching, they were permitted to conjure it at select moments, to force it from their bodies like blood that floated, casting it until they had a mere basic understanding of it. Other times, they were forcibly bled, the odd substance trickling out of their bodies like molten tar. The rest of the time, they were forbidden to experiment with Shadowtech, the autocons inside them ready to kill. To cast Shadowtech without permission meant instant death. In addition, their bodies were relentlessly trained. Their limbs were stretched into impossible positions and left that way for indeterminate lengths of time, their joints popping, their mouths open yet unable to scream. During rare moments of peace, when the autocons slunk back inside them, the four sisters sometimes held each other, tending to their wounds, enduring the Shadowtech pain together, and whispering what they hoped and dreamed for. She would often count them to make sure they were all there, reaching out and touching their heads in the dark. 1, 2, 3, all there. She could recognize them just by how their faces felt against her hands. Then she would retell the story of the two angels that had saved the four of them from the hooks on that strange day. She struggled to describe the color of the robe one of the angels had worn. She had nothing to compare it to in the dark, stony world they inhabited. She said it was the color that made her happy, a color of mercy, that reminded her of a full belly and a soft feeling when the autocons weren't around. It was their favorite story. "Tell it again," one sister would often say. She sometimes wondered if the memory of the angels was simply a kind hallucination amid an ocean of despair. Yet the scar at her back that regularly pained her was proof the angels were real. And that concludes Part 1, Chapter 1, Four Sisters. Next week, we continue Chapter 2, Sent to Die. That sounds pleasant, doesn't it? Well, until next time, this is Ren Presents. I'm your host, Ren, and be real.